you all can hear me? Okay, great. Thank you, Dr. Tyler. Thank you all for your time and support being here. Thank you to these organizations who played big roles in this project on oyster restoration in the Indian River Lagoon. So together, let's discuss some background information on oysters. Commonly here in Florida, we have the eastern oysters, Crustacea virginica. They are classified mollusca because they are invertebrates. They have the bivalve shells. So I'm only going to discuss the anatomy that is most relevant to my presentation. That is the left valve. All oysters attached with their left shell, the left valve, so they're all left-handed. And the abductor muscle is that strong muscle that allows the oysters to open and close and allow more water inside to become filtered. So let's learn a bit more about how the oysters operate. All oysters are protandra hermaphrodites, meaning that they can begin their life as male and they have the adaptation to having female reproductive organs later in life. They will not do this if the conditions in the water are not right. They prefer low salinity and low temperatures. Either one of those and a few others being off, it will cause them to preserve their energy and not reproduce. And having male organs are less energetically taxing than having female organs because females can produce up to 100 million eggs per spawning season. So once they're ready to reproduce, the oysters will release their sex gametes into the water, a sperm and an egg. That becomes fertilized. They'll go through larval stages. Once they reach the petty villager stage, that is when they are looking for a desirable habitat to settle upon one time for life. The most desirable location for them is other oysters. Though if time is running out and there are stressful circumstances, they have been noted in the Indian River Lagoon to settle upon plastic waste and litter, buckets and stuff. So in the petty villager stage, they develop that temporary pseudofoot you can see poking out at the bottom. That helps propel them around to try and find some place to settle. The next stage is the attachment stage, spat. That is what I'll be talking about throughout this presentation. So they attach in that stage, and once they grow above 25 millimeters, either horizontally or vertically, they are considered an adult oyster. So why should we protect these species and restore them? They are very important economically and biologically. Humans eat them and we create fisheries for them, and more on how they improve their life in the Indian River Lagoon. From the moment they are in that small larval stage, specifically the villager stage, they are filter feeding. And they will continue to filter feed for life on bacteria, dead stuff, phytoplankton, zooplankton, and they will help clear the water. They are not the only filter feeders in the Indian River Lagoon. There's barnacles, but oysters are larger than barnacles and they provide more habitat and food for other animals. Many things eat them, from birds to raccoons. Also, they help protect against erosion on shorelines. When oysters are placed at the shorelines, they act as a wave breaker with storms, and they can help soften the momentum of the waves in the Indian River Lagoon. So the Indian River Lagoon is where we did this study at, so let me tell you why. Indian River Lagoon, it has river in the name, but it is not a river. It was once considered to be a river, but they just tacked lagoon on at the end to make it make sense. The difference is a river has natural currents and a way of naturally flushing out pollutants, and a lagoon does not. So pollutants pile up in there, which is why it is so necessary that we care for it. It gets its great number of biodiversity by being a mix of salt and fresh water. Over 4,000 documented plant and animal species are in the Indian River Lagoon, but that's not even including the insects or the microorganisms that are also present and increase that number. It expands into 5 counties, it is 156 miles long, and it makes up for about 35% of the coast. So a little more on the status of the oysters and the Indian River Lagoon. Over time, they have faced threats which have decreased the oyster populations. These threats include overharvesting, climate change, and eutrophication, which is pollution and all the effects that come from pollution, like limited light penetration in the water, low oxygen levels, which affect the entirety of the oyster's life and their ability to reproduce and grow. This map on the right shows a bloom of many different types of blooms in the Indian River Lagoon. Specifically the reoccurring ones that come every year. You can see that green highlight in Sebastian Inlet, which is the closest where we've done the study at. So there have been efforts made to help restore these oysters. These are projects done around the same University of Florida. So these are oyster mats up in the upper top left. They are made with plastic, unfortunately, and they leak microplastics into the water. So it's kind of the reverse effects that they're trying to have. The middle is a reef prism, the lower is the reef oyster balls. And these two are made with biodegradable materials. However, their structure has, the tops are covered, which prevents oysters from growing naturally, vertically upwards, and stacking on top of each other and reforming reefs. So they could work, but it could also very well hinder them from growing naturally and as broad as they do. So these all have some issues, so another design was tested. The Community Oyster Reef Enhancement Modules, which were placed in the Indian River Lagoon, to provide home for these young oyster spats to settle upon. And once we observe more spat, hopefully these will be a good growing unit for them to reform reefs on. This is a picture of what they look like before they are deployed. They were made by the Whitney Lab at the University of Florida. They are made with a mix of concrete, wood chips, and oyster shells, adult oyster shells that were embedded halfway into the concrete and sticking out. So there's that desirable surface for the oyster spat to come and land on. And this design is environmentally friendly. They recycled the oyster shells and it is biodegradable as well. It was first tested in St. Augustine, and after the first surveying event, there were 150 to 200 spat on each module. The location for this study was 4 sites in Vero Beach along the Indian River Lagoon that already had oyster reefs present, but they were suffering from all of the previously listed threats. At each site, oh, by the way, the Environmental Learning Center is just listed as a reference, those of you who know where that is, on Wabasso, and then the green is, the Wabasso Bridge is a site, and then the rest of these are sites. So there are 6 modules at each site, and they are arranged in rows horizontally, so they're all exposed to the same variables like the tides and the water levels. And they were first deployed November 16th, 2020, so they just had a birthday. And I was not around for the manufacturing or the deployment of these modules. I was only around and studying the surveying. That's what I took part in. So every 3 months we would travel to these sites by boat and we would pick up the modules, take them onto the boats and observe the spat we saw. We would have to scrub off a bit of the dirt on the modules that would accumulate because spat have these, they can camouflage somewhat, they have a striated pattern. So that would just help to see them of all of their sizes and everything. Following Whitney Lab protocol, we would only measure 10, their width and their height. So even if there were more than 10 spat, we would observe them if they were alive or if they were dead, but we just wouldn't record their width or their height. And we would also take note of any other species that were attached onto them. The upper right is what they look like at the sites, and this is what they look like when we're surveying them in the lower right. And this picture here shows that striated pattern that the spat have. And that is a live spat, for example. So at 3 out of 4 of the sites, we have observed a lot of spat on our modules. However, at one of the sites, there were continuously no spat. The problem was when we placed them initially, they were too far upshore, so they weren't exposed to the water levels or any spat that was coming to settle on them, so we moved them further down. Same problem. It was too far inshore, so we moved them down. Same problem. So that's a learning experience at that Northern Relief Canal, which had 0 continuously, but we will continue to monitor that. At all other locations, though, we have observed spat. At the Wabasso Causeway, these are the results. Please note that modules 5 and 6 have gone missing at this site. That is because it's the only site that is accessible to people by foot. So, I'm not pointing fingers, but I see fishermen, some kids playing around there, so that's possible. And you'll also notice that there is no growth at all in February. That is because the oyster spawning season happens in late spring to early summer, so growth picks up over that time. As the results at Round Island, modules 3 and 4 are still here and still present, still well intact, but there were just no spat on there, oddly. So, at the Southern Relief Canal, that's where we saw our top results and the most spat. Nearly every module had its maximum number of spat that we could record. And also, again, you'll notice February is the same, but that growth definitely increased. So there was a total of 100 spat on those modules. These are the other organisms we did see on the modules. It's important to note the barnacles. They are spatial competitors for the spat. So spat will not come and settle over top of them. There's nothing we're going to do about the barnacles. We're not going to scrape them off or anything. They're welcome. They're okay. That's actually a native species, but we were looking for oysters and spat. So, and the green algae is a good sign too. It's always a good sign. So like I mentioned before, February and May counts were low, and then it definitely increased as the spawning season timed up with that, and more oyster spat were accumulating in the water and looking for their desirable home. The Southern Relief Canal had the most, potentially because it had the largest pre-existing reef there. It was a really beautiful reef. I was happy to see it. We have learned that the modules must be submerged in water, at least partially, to allow the spat to have enough room to come settle upon them and be exposed to the water at that time. And at the Wabasso Causeway, man-made destruction had hindered our results because we lost some modules, and even like the sides of them were becoming chipped, and I do suspect that's from human access to them. So our results point to success because we saw 100 spat on our modules, and also on our modules we had 60 spat that have grown past 25 millimeters, so they have grown into adulthood. So these reefs are hopefully going to reform, but we will continue to monitor them and test them and see how they do. So, and this is a picture at one of the sites. So this is the Round Island site. A big thanks to Matthew Anderson and the company at Department of Environmental Protection and the Indian River Lagoon Aquatics Preserve for providing the materials needed for this project and for taking me out to the sites. And thank you to Amy Shea and the Environmental Learning Center for first connecting me to this group. And thank you everyone here today. Questions or elaborate?
Yes, any questions? I might be completely wrong on this, but I was under the impression that growing oysters is one of the more successful forms of aquaculture. But saying how some of them are grown, that actually can have a long-term negative effect on oyster populations?
Interesting. Yeah, that's a good question. I guess it has to do with how you do it. Like with everything, you could do it naturally, or if it's like mixed with the microplastics, if they're in the right temperatures. We try to do ours as naturally as possible, and these, due to like the quality of Indian River Lagoon, they were needed there.
So do you think this research that you're doing could ultimately lead to like, better aquaculture techniques?
Hopefully. Yeah, because this design is relatively new, it's being tested, and at these locations, we are still observing, like, getting more data on when they settle, how they grow, how long it takes, and like I mentioned before, due to the conditions in the water, sometimes they won't even want to reproduce and switch to having those female sex gametes because it's too energetically taxing to have those female organs. So the more data we get on what specific levels they need, that could very much help with determining.
It'd be fantastic if you guys can figure out a way to improve aquaculture, but at the same time actually kind of restore the natural environment.
Yeah, for sure. Whenever I am around these areas, whenever I pick up a module and everything, I just see a bunch of crabs and critters fall out of it. So it's just amazing seeing how reliant they are on it, and actually looking at other tests done where they do keep them in a more like visible aquaculture area where they test how they filter water, and you can see it's estimated they filter 50 gallons of water a day. Just like one oyster colony will do that, and seeing how they take the mucky water at first and then how it becomes clear, that's very good information to see, and I think it's very necessary. And yeah, it's great to learn about them because they're all over, and they're silently working, but doing so much for us.
Hi, Angel. I have a question about your round island site where you had some modules with no growth. Was that because you had a lot of barnacles and things on the, or water conditions, or?
That's a good guess. I'm not 100% sure because I took a lot of data and pictures, and I looked over the data sheets. I don't recall exactly what was on those 3 or 4 modules. I believe we had substantial barnacle growth on nearly every one. But that's a very good guess. It's just odd to me how like they're placed in order, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the ones on the edges had spat, and the 2 in the middle didn't.
Yeah. Well, I have the same question for you I've been asking the others. Are you graduating this semester, and if so, what's next?
I did my senior project a little bit early, so I am still working for my bachelor's degree. I'm just going to be continuing with this study and a few other studies. What's next for me? I got hired at a place I had an internship at, the Environmental Learning Center in Vero Beach. So I got hired in October, and I'm sticking with that for a little bit because we both have a lot to offer each other. The Environmental Learning Center to me, and he's the Environmental Learning Center. So that's really nice. And as far as future school goes, I'd be happy to keep working and studying. I love to learn. I love to have things to do with the environment.
Any more questions?
I have so I just happen to know that at Round Island, a lot of the seagrass has recently died, and I don't know if Glenn Coulter is here, but he's pretty actively involved trying to figure out what's going on there. So maybe there's something interesting that's happening there that.
That's a very good point, because like at the Southern Relief Canal where we had the most growth, there was also a lot of aquatic plants around that reef. So those aquatic plants, I assume, must have helped the spat and the oyster reef feel less pressure to be the only ones that are the wave breakers, the only ones providing clarity there. So I do think the mix of having the 2 is a big help for them.
Any other questions? Thank you, Angel, very much.